George Washington was born on February 22, 1732, on a modest plantation in Westmoreland County, Virginia, part of the British colonies in North America. His family belonged to the landed gentry but was far from wealthy aristocracy, and their fortunes relied on the uncertain yields of tobacco fields and the labor of enslaved workers. His father, Augustine Washington, was a man of ambition who tried to secure prosperity through farming and small industrial ventures. Yet his death in 1743, when George was only 11, shattered much of the family's fragile stability. The responsibility for the family estates passed to George's older half-brother, Lawrence, leaving young George without a direct paternal guide during his formative years. This early loss shaped him profoundly, instilling in him a sense of duty and the need to rely on his own strength to achieve anything in life. George was sent to live part of the time with Lawrence at Mount Vernon, a more refined estate overlooking the Potomac River. There he was exposed to a world of colonial sophistication and ambition, surrounded by visitors who were wealthy planters, merchants, and military men. He observed their manners and conversations carefully, absorbing lessons about honor, reputation, and the subtle codes that governed colonial high society. Despite his interest in these upper circles, George's formal education was limited. He never attended university like many of his contemporaries from wealthy families. Instead, he received a basic schooling in reading, writing, and arithmetic, supplemented by self-directed study. He was especially drawn to mathematics and geometry, subjects that promised practical application and offered a route to professional advancement. As a teenager, Washington displayed a quiet determination and an unusual seriousness. While other boys sought entertainment and idle diversion, he kept notebooks filled with copied maxims about ethics and conduct, striving to mold his character. He studied treatises on land surveying, navigation, and geography, practicing with compass and chain in the fields around Mount Vernon. This skill set soon opened a path for him. The expanding colonial frontier needed men who could measure and map it, transforming wilderness into property. In 1748, through Lawrence's influence, George joined a surveying expedition organized by the Fairfax family, one of the most powerful clans in Virginia. For the first time, he ventured into the rugged Shenandoah Valley, enduring harsh conditions, sleeping under the stars, and traversing dense forests and swift rivers. These expeditions hardened him physically and gave him a sense of independence. He encountered settlers carving homesteads from the wilderness and saw firsthand the tension simmering between colonial expansion and the lands of indigenous peoples. The work demanded precision and endurance, but it also rewarded him with a taste of autonomy. By the age of 17, he had earned an official commission as a county surveyor. This position brought him steady income and local respect, rare achievements for someone of his age and background. He bought his first parcels of land from the wages he saved, beginning a lifelong accumulation of property that would anchor his wealth and influence. While he was building his professional reputation, Washington also absorbed the rigid hierarchies of colonial Virginia. Society was stratified, with wealthy planters at the top, small farmers and tradesmen in the middle, and enslaved Africans forming the base of the economy. Washington was neither at the pinnacle nor at the bottom. He belonged to the middling gentry, ambitious but not yet powerful. He studied the customs and expectations of the elite carefully, determined to rise among them through discipline and honor rather than birthright. He became skilled in the art of self-presentation, learning to control his emotions and carry himself with dignity, traits that later became hallmarks of his public persona. Lawrence's mentorship profoundly influenced him during these years. Lawrence had served as a captain in the British colonial forces and spoke admiringly of the British military tradition. Through him, George came to revere the idea of military service as a noble calling and the British Empire as a grand structure offering order and opportunity. This admiration planted the seeds of his early aspiration to become an officer, a dream that seemed distant for a colonial-born youth but fueled his efforts to refine himself. When Lawrence fell ill with tuberculosis and died in 1752, George, at only 20, inherited Mount Vernon, gaining both a physical estate and a symbolic mantle of responsibility. This inheritance marked the end of his boyhood and the beginning of his life as a public figure in Virginia society. By the early 1750s, Washington had forged a reputation as a reliable, industrious, and ambitious young man. His early years had taught him the value of self-reliance, the discipline of hard work, and the importance of honor in a world where reputation could make or break a man. He had grown up in a society that was both deeply British in culture and increasingly restless under distant rule, and within him stirred a nascent sense of belonging to the land itself, rather than merely to the empire that claimed it. Though he could not have foreseen the extraordinary path that lay ahead, the contours of his character were already visible: the resilience born of loss, the hunger for achievement, and the belief that destiny favored those willing to labor tirelessly toward it. These traits, formed in the fields and forests of colonial Virginia, would become the bedrock of the man he was destined to become.
At 20 years old, George Washington stepped into the uncertain world of military life, leaving behind the familiar estates of Virginia for the wild, uncharted forests of the Ohio Valley. He entered service as a young and ambitious officer of the Virginia militia, his uniform still crisp, his confidence untested by the rigors of war. The 7 Years' War, though not yet fully ignited, loomed on the horizon, and the frontier simmered with tension between French forces and British colonial settlers. Washington was thrust into this volatile landscape where survival depended not only on courage but on cunning and adaptability. His first expedition took him deep into the wilderness, where dense woods muffled sound and every shadow could hide an enemy. He led a small detachment through swampy ground and rain-soaked trails, burdened by supply wagons that often bogged down in the mud. He studied maps by firelight, tracing rivers and ridges, imagining routes where none yet existed. Each decision he made carried weight, for the lives of his men rested on his judgment. When his unit ambushed a French scouting party near Jumonville Glen, he tasted the raw chaos of combat for the first time. Muskets cracking in the mist, men shouting and falling, the air sharp with the smell of powder. The clash ended quickly, yet it reverberated across the frontier, drawing British and French forces into open conflict. Washington understood then how a single skirmish could ripple outward, reshaping the fate of nations. Soon after, he found himself responsible for the construction and defense of a makeshift fort they named Fort Necessity. The ground was low and wet, the walls hurriedly built from felled logs, and the men were weary from constant labor. As rain poured and the French forces closed in, Washington faced his first major trial as a commander. The battle was brutal and chaotic, with musket fire muffled by the relentless downpour. The trenches flooded, powder became useless, and casualties mounted. Surrounded and outnumbered, Washington agreed to surrender, securing safe passage for his men, but marking the encounter as a humiliating defeat. He carried the weight of that failure heavily, replaying each decision in his mind and seeing where pride had clouded judgment. Yet in this defeat, he began to understand the necessity of preparation, discipline, and humility in command. Undeterred, he sought redemption and returned to the frontier alongside British General Edward Braddock in a grand expedition to seize Fort Duquesne from the French. Braddock, a seasoned officer from the Old World, viewed colonial soldiers with thinly veiled disdain, dismissing their experience in woodland warfare as inferior to European discipline. Washington watched this arrogance with quiet frustration, recognizing how poorly suited traditional European tactics were to the dense forests and hidden trails of the American interior. When the column finally moved forward, drums beating and red-coated ranks marching in precise formation, they walked unknowingly into disaster. French troops and their native allies struck from the shadows, unleashing gunfire from the dense thickets. Chaos erupted as the disciplined lines dissolved into confusion. Horses screamed, men dropped, and smoke choked the forest air.
In the heart of this slaughter, Washington rode back and forth across the field, rallying fleeing soldiers and carrying orders through the gunfire. 2 horses were shot from under him, and bullet holes pierced his coat, yet he remained unscathed, a figure of desperate resolve amid the carnage. When Braddock fell mortally wounded, command faltered, and Washington took charge of the retreat, gathering survivors and leading them back through miles of hostile wilderness. It was not a victory, but his composure under fire earned him admiration and revealed to himself a latent capacity for leadership under extreme pressure. In the years that followed, Washington continued to serve on the frontier, overseeing the defense of Virginia's long and vulnerable border. He coordinated patrols through endless miles of forest, built small stockades at river crossings, and managed supplies that were always too few and men who were often untrained. He witnessed the cruelty of frontier warfare, villages burned, families scattered, and the constant threat of ambush along every wooded path. The isolation weighed heavily on him, and he wrestled with frustration at the British command, who ignored colonial pleas for reinforcements and resources. Their dismissive treatment of colonial officers stung deeply, a reminder that in the imperial hierarchy, he and his compatriots were seen as lesser, their sacrifices undervalued. Yet amid these hardships, Washington's resolve hardened. He learned to adapt to scarcity, to anticipate the enemy's movements, and to preserve the lives of his men by choosing when to fight and when to withdraw. The wilderness became both his adversary and his teacher, forcing him to sharpen his instincts and temper his ambition with caution. Each campaign carved away the naivety of youth, replacing it with the cool discipline of experience. He began to carry himself differently, with the measured calm of one who had seen chaos and endured it. By the end of the war, Washington was no longer the untested youth who had once marched into the forest seeking glory. He emerged as a seasoned officer, scarred by failure yet strengthened by endurance. The lessons of the frontier, its hardships, its betrayals, and its merciless demands on leadership etched themselves deeply into his character. They forged in him a quiet determination, a conviction that respect must be earned through action, not granted by birth or title. Though he returned to civilian life for a time, the war had transformed him. It had shown him both the fragility of human ambition and the resilience required to uphold it. In the crucible of those wild campaigns, George Washington was tempered into something far stronger than the eager youth who had first shouldered a musket. He became a leader who would one day carry the weight of a revolution.
In the years following the end of the 7 Years' War, George Washington returned to Virginia and attempted to shape a quieter life for himself. The restless energy of his youth had been tempered by the harsh lessons of the frontier, and he sought stability on his sprawling estate at Mount Vernon. His marriage to Martha Custis, a wealthy widow, brought him not only affection and companionship, but also considerable land and influence, solidifying his place among the planter elite of Virginia. He oversaw fields of tobacco, wheat, and corn, supervised enslaved laborers, and managed a growing network of business dealings that tied him to the wider Atlantic economy. For a time, it seemed as though the turbulence of war had passed, and that the path before him was one of peaceful prosperity. Yet beneath the serene rhythm of plantation life, Washington began to sense the tightening grip of imperial control. The British government, burdened by the staggering costs of the recent war, turned to its colonies for revenue. New taxes and trade restrictions emerged in steady succession: the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and various duties on imported goods. These measures, crafted in distant halls of Parliament, struck Washington as both intrusive and unjust. He believed in loyalty to the crown, yet he also believed that such loyalty should be met with respect and representation. To him, the notion that colonists should bear the weight of imperial debts without a voice in the decisions that bound them violated the principles of English liberty he had been taught to revere. As a member of the Virginia House of Burgesses, Washington watched these tensions escalate with growing concern. He was not a man given to fiery speeches or radical gestures, but his presence carried weight, and his opinions were sought by others who valued his judgment. In quiet conversations and informal debates, he aligned himself with those who opposed the new taxes, supporting non-importation agreements and calls for colonial unity. He did not yet speak of independence, for the very idea seemed dangerous and extreme, but he understood that the colonies could not remain passive if they wished to preserve their rights. Each new act from London seemed to press harder on colonial self-government, and each protest from America seemed to be met with disdain. The British response to resistance deepened his disillusionment. When protests erupted in Boston and royal troops occupied the city, Washington observed from afar but felt the implications acutely. The use of military force against British subjects troubled him profoundly. He knew the power of an army, the chaos it could unleash, and he recognized how swiftly oppression could ignite rebellion. In letters to fellow planters and political allies, he expressed frustration at Parliament's obstinacy and warned that unchecked authority could drive even the most loyal subjects to desperation. He spoke less of petitioning and more of preparing, hinting that the colonies might someday need to stand together in their own defense. Meanwhile, his own experiences fed this transformation. Trade restrictions and taxes strained his plantation's finances, limiting his ability to export tobacco and forcing him to rely on British merchants who treated colonial planters as inferiors. He felt the economic noose tightening, and with it came a growing sense of vulnerability. Washington prided himself on self-reliance, yet he saw how deeply colonial wealth depended on the decisions of distant men who neither understood nor respected American interests. This dependence gnawed at him, planting the seeds of a conviction that true security could never exist without some measure of independence. By the early 1770s, the air in Virginia, as in the other colonies, was thick with unease. The Boston Tea Party and the harsh reprisals that followed sent shockwaves through the colonies, convincing many that Britain intended to rule by coercion rather than consent. Washington watched as royal authority tightened its grip, and he sensed that the old bonds were fraying beyond repair. In meetings of the Burgesses, he supported resolutions condemning British overreach and helped organize the flow of supplies to Boston in solidarity. Though his demeanor remained reserved, his commitment to the colonial cause deepened, and others began to look to him as a figure of steady resolve amid the growing storm. When the First Continental Congress was called in 1774, Washington's reputation made him a natural choice as one of Virginia's delegates. He journeyed north to Philadelphia, leaving the familiar fields of Mount Vernon for the charged atmosphere of colonial unity. There, among merchants, lawyers, and planters from across the continent, he saw for the first time the breadth of American resistance. The grievances were many, but they shared a common thread: the belief that the colonies had matured into something more than mere possessions of the crown. Washington listened more than he spoke, but his quiet authority did not go unnoticed. His presence lent gravity to the Virginian delegation, and his measured support for collective action helped bridge the gap between the cautious moderates and the increasingly defiant radicals. Though he still hoped for reconciliation, Washington understood by then that events were slipping beyond the reach of compromise. He had entered public life believing himself a loyal subject of the British Empire, yet each step had carried him further from that identity. The frontier had taught him the cost of neglect, the plantation had shown him the way of dependence, and politics revealed the brittleness of imperial bonds stretched across an ocean. As he departed Philadelphia at the close of the Congress, he carried with him the unsettling realization that the colonies were on the threshold of something immense and irrevocable. He did not yet know what shape it would take, but he sensed that he would be called to stand at its center. By the time Washington returned to Mount Vernon, his path had quietly shifted. He resumed the routines of his estate, but he did so with the awareness that the world around him was changing, the ground trembling beneath familiar patterns. He had not sought rebellion, yet rebellion was drawing nearer, and he was no longer the young officer who once sought only personal honor. He was becoming, piece by piece, the man others would one day follow into the uncertainty of revolution. When the American War of Independence erupted in 1775, George Washington stood at a turning point that would define not only his life, but the fate of 13 embattled colonies. The Continental Congress, searching for a figure who could unite the disparate militias under a single banner, appointed him as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. His stature, both literal and symbolic, his reputation for discipline, and his Virginian roots made him a choice acceptable to both the southern and northern colonies. Accepting the commission, Washington understood the gravity of the task before him: to mold an untrained, ill-equipped force of farmers, merchants, and laborers into an army capable of resisting the mightiest empire on earth. He took command near Boston, where colonial militias had besieged British troops. From the outset, he faced staggering obstacles. His forces lacked uniforms, arms, ammunition, and even basic supplies. Men deserted as quickly as they enlisted, and those who remained often served only for short terms. Disease stalked the camps, and discipline was fragile. Washington moved methodically to impose order, drilling his troops, standardizing procedures, and instituting strict codes of conduct. He spent as much time writing letters pleading for supplies and money as he did planning military maneuvers. Every skirmish, every encampment tested his ability to hold this fragile army together. The early campaigns brought more setbacks than triumphs. In 1776, after forcing the British to evacuate Boston, Washington tried to defend New York City, a crucial strategic port. There, he faced a disciplined British army backed by a powerful navy. The battles went disastrously. Outnumbered and outmaneuvered, the Continental Army suffered defeat after defeat, retreating across the length of New Jersey. The losses threatened to crush the Revolution before it truly began. Morale crumbled, enlistments expired, and Congress teetered on the edge of despair. Yet Washington refused to surrender the cause. He retreated in good order, preserving the core of his army, and waited for the moment to strike back. That moment came in the dead of winter. On Christmas night, 1776, he led his ragged troops across the ice-choked Delaware River to surprise a Hessian garrison at Trenton. The victory was small in scale, but immense in psychological weight. It revived American spirits, convinced wavering men to re-enlist, and showed that the Revolution still breathed. A week later, he won another sharp engagement at Princeton, forcing the British to withdraw from much of New Jersey. These swift, daring moves restored Washington's reputation and bought the Revolution precious time. Still, he knew these were fleeting victories. The long struggle lay ahead. In the campaigns that followed, Washington adopted a strategy of endurance. He avoided risking his army in decisive set-piece battles, knowing a single catastrophic defeat could end the Revolution. Instead, he sought to harass, outmaneuver, and outlast the enemy, stretching British lines and sapping their will. This approach demanded immense patience and self-control. He endured defeats at Brandywine and Germantown in 1777, yet kept his army intact. When his troops wintered at Valley Forge, they endured hunger, cold, and disease so severe that thousands perished or deserted. Washington stayed among them, sharing their privations and holding the remnants of the army together through sheer force of will. It was there that Baron von Steuben, a Prussian officer, helped drill the survivors into a more disciplined force, giving the Continental Army a hardened core it had previously lacked. The tide began to turn when France, persuaded by the American victory at Saratoga and by Washington's tenacity, formally allied with the colonies in 1778. French ships and soldiers opened a new dimension to the war, stretching British resources and bolstering American morale. Washington now commanded a more credible force, but he still faced the daunting task of coordinating diverse militias, state governments, and the Continental Congress, all while maintaining unity among men from different regions and backgrounds. He walked a constant tightrope between civilian oversight and military necessity, always careful to show deference to Congress even when he found its interference maddening. He understood that the revolution's survival depended as much on preserving Republican principles as on winning battles. Years of grinding warfare followed. Washington's army shadowed British forces across the countryside, striking when opportunity allowed and retreating when threatened. He fought them to a stalemate at Monmouth and kept the rebellion alive while British attention shifted to the southern colonies. Through these years, he grew not only as a military commander, but as a political figure, embodying the unity the fragile new nation desperately needed. He cultivated an image of stoic resolve, masking his frustrations and doubts. Privately, he wrestled with the weight of responsibility, the constant shortages, and the fear that a single misstep could doom the cause. Publicly, he remained the calm center of the storm, a symbol of perseverance. In 1781, a decisive chance finally appeared. British General Cornwallis entrenched his army at Yorktown, Virginia, expecting rescue by the Royal Navy. Washington seized the opportunity. With French General Rochambeau's troops marching alongside his own, and the French fleet under Admiral de Grasse blocking British reinforcements by sea, he executed a rapid and secret march south from New York. The coordination was audacious and unprecedented, a testament to the alliances and discipline he had forged. In the siege that followed, American and French forces tightened a ring around Yorktown, bombarding British positions until Cornwallis surrendered in October. The victory stunned Britain and broke the back of its will to continue the war. Though formal peace would not come until 1783, Yorktown marked the effective end of major combat. Washington had done what once seemed impossible. He had held together a fragile rebellion, forged an army from chaos, endured years of defeat and deprivation, and emerged victorious over one of the world's great powers. He returned to his camp not with the exultation of a conqueror, but with the quiet relief of a man who had borne an unbearable burden and survived. To his soldiers, to Congress, and to the people, he became the embodiment of the revolution itself, steadfast, unyielding, and incorruptible. He had led an untrained army to independence, and in doing so became a national hero, the living symbol of courage and endurance upon which the idea of the new United States began to rest.
After the guns fell silent and the Treaty of Paris confirmed American independence, George Washington made a decision that astonished the world. Rather than cling to the power he had won through 8 years of struggle, he resigned his commission and returned to Mount Vernon. His departure from public life was quiet and deliberate, a gesture that contrasted with the ambition and self-aggrandizement often seen in victorious generals throughout history. By laying down his sword, he demonstrated that the revolution had not been fought to establish a new despot, but to create a republic governed by laws. This act elevated his reputation as a selfless patriot and set a precedent that military authority must remain subordinate to civilian rule. At Mount Vernon, he sought the peace of private life, tending to his plantations and overseeing the restoration of his neglected estate. He managed crop rotations, improved buildings, and experimented with new farming techniques, hoping to make his lands productive again after years of wartime neglect. Yet even as he immersed himself in agriculture, he could not escape the growing turmoil of the fledgling nation. The Articles of Confederation had created a weak central government, and the states quarreled over boundaries, trade, and debts. The national treasury was empty, foreign powers tested the young republic's resolve, and internal unrest, such as Shays' Rebellion, revealed the fragility of the new order. From every corner came calls for Washington to return, not as a soldier, but as a unifying figure capable of guiding the nation toward stability. Reluctantly, he answered. In 1787, he traveled to Philadelphia to attend the Constitutional Convention. His mere presence lent legitimacy to the gathering, and the delegates unanimously elected him its presiding officer. He spoke little during the debates, preferring to let others craft the details, but his silent authority shaped the atmosphere. His reputation for integrity restrained factionalism and encouraged compromise. Delegates from large and small states, from the North and the South, clashed over representation, slavery, and federal power. But Washington's watchful stewardship helped them remain focused on the larger purpose, forging a durable framework for self-government. The Constitution that emerged bore the imprint of his character, strong yet balanced, firm yet restrained. When the new Constitution was ratified, there was little doubt about who should lead the nation under its provisions. In 1789, the Electoral College unanimously chose Washington as the first president of the United States. He accepted the office not with triumph, but with a sense of duty and foreboding. He understood that everything he did would establish precedents. There were no guidelines, no tested practices, only the fragile hopes of a people attempting something unprecedented. His inauguration in New York City was solemn rather than celebratory, and he addressed the nation with humility, declaring that he had accepted the office only out of obedience to the public will. Once in office, Washington set about building the machinery of government from the ground up. He created the first cabinet, appointing Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State, Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Knox as Secretary of War, and Edmund Randolph as Attorney General. He established the principle that the executive should consult its advisors but remain ultimately responsible for decisions. Under his leadership, Hamilton designed a financial system that stabilized the nation's credit, assumed state debts, and created a national bank, while Jefferson guided foreign policy and sought to maintain American neutrality. Washington navigated their fierce ideological rivalry with measured patience, always striving to hold the government above partisan squabbles. He toured the states to promote unity, showing citizens that the new federal government belonged to them all. He upheld the authority of the Constitution by suppressing the Whiskey Rebellion, proving that the government could enforce its laws while offering clemency to the rebels once order was restored. He signed the Bill of Rights, safeguarding individual liberties while strengthening public trust. He maintained strict neutrality in foreign affairs, resisting pressure to take sides in the wars that convulsed Europe, and negotiated treaties that secured America's borders and opened new markets for its trade. Through all these actions, he sought to place the Republic on solid ground, ensuring it could survive beyond his personal leadership. Yet Washington carried the weight of the office heavily. He often longed to retire, lamenting the endless criticism and the burden of responsibility. He feared that the growth of political factions would tear the young nation apart, and he worked tirelessly to hold competing interests together. He never forgot that he was setting examples for those who would follow. He refused titles of grandeur, rejecting any trappings of monarchy, and insisted on being addressed simply as Mr. President. His restraint helped entrench the principle that the presidency was a temporary trust, not a personal prize. When his first term ended, he wished to step down, but the deep divisions within the government convinced him to serve again for the sake of continuity. His second term was consumed by partisan strife between Federalists and Democratic Republicans, but he continued to steer a neutral course. Near its conclusion, he composed his farewell address, warning against the dangers of factionalism and entangling foreign alliances, and urging future leaders to place the common good above personal ambition. In 1797, after 2 terms, he refused a third and retired, establishing the precedent of peaceful transfer of power. By the time he returned to Mount Vernon, he had done more than lead a revolution. He had constructed the foundations of a functioning republic. He had shown that power could be wielded with restraint, that authority could serve liberty rather than extinguish it. Through his character and his choices, he transformed the fragile confederation of former colonies into a nation with enduring institutions. Washington emerged from his presidency not as a ruler, but as a servant who had given shape and stability to the aspirations of millions. His legacy as the founder of the American nation was secured not by conquest, but by his steadfast devotion to principle and by his willingness to surrender power so that the republic might endure.
When George Washington left the presidency after 2 terms, he did so with a solemn finality that astonished the world. No leader of a revolution had ever stepped aside so willingly, surrendering the power he could have kept. By refusing a 3rd term, he confirmed that the office of president was not a throne, but a temporary trust bestowed by the people. This single act anchored the principle of peaceful transfer of power within the young republic, showing that the United States would be governed by laws rather than by the ambitions of men. Monarchs and ministers across Europe watched in disbelief, while Americans saw in his retirement the ultimate proof of his devotion to the ideals for which they had fought. He became not only the first president, but the measure by which all future presidents would be judged. Returning to Mount Vernon in 1797, Washington sought again the quiet rhythms of private life that had so often eluded him. His estate had grown into a complex network of farms, workshops, and households, and he managed it with the same discipline he had once brought to the army and the government. He oversaw crop rotations, supervised his laborers, and expanded his experiments with new agricultural methods, introducing innovations like the 16-sided threshing barn. He kept meticulous accounts, monitored the distillery that produced whiskey on his lands, and sought to reduce the estate's debts. Though his days were filled with the practical demands of land and labor, his thoughts remained fixed on the fragile republic he had helped create. He followed news from the capital with close attention, offering occasional advice in private letters, but resisting every attempt to draw him back into public affairs. He wanted the nation to stand on its own, without leaning on his presence. Yet, even in retirement, Washington remained a living symbol. Visitors from across the world came to Mount Vernon to pay their respects, treating his home as a place of pilgrimage. Statesmen and travelers saw in him a figure who embodied the virtues the Republic claimed to uphold: restraint, honor, and duty. His reputation united Americans across party lines, even as political divisions deepened in the years following his presidency. Newspapers invoked his name to justify competing visions of the country, and both Federalists and Democratic Republicans claimed his legacy as their own. He had become more than a man. He was the living conscience of the Republic. In 1798, with tensions rising between the United States and revolutionary France, President John Adams persuaded him to accept the nominal role of commander of a provisional army, though Washington made clear that he would serve only if war broke out. The gesture reassured a nervous nation, but war never came, and he never returned to the field. His health, once robust, began to falter under the strain of age and the relentless schedule he imposed upon himself. He rode daily across his expansive property, even in cold and damp weather, overseeing every detail of its operations. The winter of 1799 brought bitter rains and raw winds, and he often remained outdoors for hours without proper protection, refusing to neglect his duties. On December 12, after riding through snow and sleet to inspect his lands, he returned soaked and chilled. He dined without changing his wet clothes and went to bed feeling only slightly ill. By the next day, a sore throat had become a severe inflammation, and by the morning of December 14th, he struggled to breathe. Physicians were summoned and tried desperately to save him through bleeding and other common treatments of the time, but their efforts only weakened him further. Washington remained composed and orderly even as his strength faded, giving instructions for the disposition of his papers and estate. That evening, as the winter light dimmed over Mount Vernon, George Washington died peacefully in his bed, surrounded by those who had served him faithfully. He was 67 years old. News of his death spread with astonishing speed, and the reaction was unlike anything the nation had seen. Bells tolled in every city, black drapery hung from public buildings, and citizens wept openly in the streets. Memorial services were held from New England to the frontier settlements, and eulogies hailed him as the father of his country. Congress wore mourning bands for 30 days, and the House chamber was draped in black. Even in Europe, where monarchs had once viewed him with suspicion, tributes poured forth. Napoleon Bonaparte ordered 10 days of mourning for him in France, declaring that Washington is dead. This great man fought against tyranny and consolidated the liberty of his country. The world recognized that a figure of singular character had passed from it. In death, Washington's image assumed a near mythic quality. Artists painted him as a modern Cincinnatus, a man who relinquished power to serve the public good, while writers portrayed him as the embodiment of republican virtue. His farewell address became a sacred text recited in schools and cited by statesmen. The principles he had championed, civilian supremacy over the military, voluntary limits on executive power, national unity above faction, were woven into the fabric of American political culture. Every president who followed him measured their conduct against his, and every peaceful transition of power bore the imprint of his example. His name became synonymous with the Republic itself, a symbol of integrity, restraint, and selfless service. Washington's final legacy lay not in monuments or declarations, but in the habits of government and citizenship he left behind. He had shown that true greatness did not require domination or personal glory, but fidelity to duty and the willingness to place the common good above ambition. The nation he helped create endured precisely because he chose to step aside and let it govern itself. As generations passed, his presence remained like a steady foundation beneath the shifting currents of politics. To Americans, he became the guardian spirit of the Republic, silently reminding them that the strength of their country depended not on the power of its leaders, but on their character. By the time the century turned, Washington had passed fully into the realm of legend, yet his influence remained tangible in the institutions he had shaped and the ideals he had embodied. The United States moved forward into an uncertain future, but it carried with it the example of the man who had shown how power could be used without corruption, how authority could coexist with liberty, and how leadership could be rooted not in the hunger for power, but in the humility of service. This was the enduring gift he left to the Republic, a moral inheritance as vital as the nation itself.